Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. Ahmed a-Shar'a's honeymoon as Syria's new ruler lasted exactly 3 months and ended predictably in bloodshed. Hundreds of civilians, mostly members of the Alawite minority, which flourished under the despotic Assad dynasty, were massacred by the new regime's loyalists. a-Shar'a's efforts to portray his jihadist identity as belonging to the past were exposed as a sham. The chaos in Israel's northernmost neighbor thus proved that Jerusalem's cautious policy of forward deployment and relations with the Druze community and other majorities as well was indeed the correct one to adopt. Joining us to analyze Israel's quest for security in the midst of Syria's instability all the way from the United States include Professor Russell Berman, who formerly served as a senior advisor at the U.S. State Department's policy planning staff. Currently, he's the director of the Middle East and Islamic World Working Group at Hoover Institution at Stanford University. It's good to have you with us, sir.
Thanks for having me back, Jonathan.
Absolutely. Also joining us is Colonel in Reserve Oren Ben Shalom, who is a senior fellow at the Institute for Counterterrorism at Reichman University, as well as a cross-cultural strategist. It's a pleasure to have you with us as well, Colonel.
Hello, thank you.
And last but not least, TV7's editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, set the stage for us.
So the Israeli Northern Front is, of course, composed of Syria and Lebanon, which used to be one political unit, but are no longer so. And as we were convening this panel, the Israeli government has announced that it has started negotiations with Lebanon on demarcating the border between the countries, as well as the fate of the 5 points inside southern Lebanon, which the IDF is holding for now. So this is obviously a very promising subject, and we will put it aside for a moment, but it does have an impact on what happens in the other sector, in the Syrian one, because both in Lebanon and in Syria, the Israeli Air Force has been striking targets which were deemed to threaten the security of Israel, such as new installations or intelligence gathering by Hezbollah or other hostile forces, or even efforts by the Syrian army, perhaps should be called the old new Syrian army, to try and watch the Israeli Air Force flying over Syria. In addition to that, as you mentioned, Jonathan, in your introduction, there is this development which probably has to do with the Turkish government too, the Turks and their rapprochement with the Kurds. So the Kurdish organization or the Kurdish element within the SDF has now reached a sort of a tentative agreement with a-Shar'a. Of course, we have to wait and see whether and how it will be implemented. And the question is, have we said goodbye to the old Shiite axis of the Iranians, the pro-Iranian militias in Iraq, Hezbollah, and the Alawites, which are, in a way, sort of Shiites? And now we are welcoming, quote unquote, the new Sunni jihadi axis. And the way the world approaches what the a-Shar'a regime has done over the last several days, massacring the Alawites, will give us a clue to what is going to happen going forward.
Professor Berman, I'd like to refer the next question to you. If we're talking particularly about the situation in Syria, vis-a-vis particularly also the Kurdish arrangement reached with the Damascus regime of the de facto leader, President Abu Muhammad al-Julani, as he was known during his days in Al-Qaeda as well as the Islamic State. we see that CENTCOM sought, on the one hand, to encourage the SDF leadership of the Kurdish, predominantly Kurdish militias to reach an understanding with Damascus on the one hand. It remains unclear whether or not this was also a directive out of Washington. But nonetheless, we also hear U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio coming out and stating openly to his host, namely Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, during a visit in Riyadh, that the two are discussing matters about the future of the government in Syria, that they want to bolster on the one hand, but that it will be also free from terrorism. What does that mean?
It's a it's a complicated puzzle, Jonathan. First of all, the U.S. has had a presence in northeast Syria that President Trump has been critical of in the past. We don't know yet what the Trump administration's policy will be toward that presence, but I imagine that CENTCOM is encouraging the Kurds to come to an agreement with Damascus must reflect a potential of reduced U.S. presence in the area. I'm just speculating on that. I have no particular information on that, but it would seem to me to be the logical conclusion that Secretary of State Rubio is talking in Saudi about the Levant is a good sign insofar as it presumably indicates that the Saudis may be interested in re-engaging in the region altogether. They've pulled out of Lebanon long ago, and maybe it's time for this powerhouse in the Gulf to begin to pull its weight in providing some kind of stability, both in Beirut and in Damascus.
Absolutely. Well, Colonel Ben Shalom, when we look at the complexity of Israel's efforts to ensure its red lines, as it has declared very clearly that it will not allow the HTS or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham regime in Damascus to bolster its forces, including strategic forces south of Damascus. I assume it has a reference to the neighborhood of Jaramana, which is a southern Damascus neighborhood, all the way to the border with Israel and even to the southern border of Sweda with the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. Israel has launched an aerial campaign to ensure that those red lines are enforced despite efforts to breach them. What can you tell us about that?
I think we can see two separate things. On the one hand, as far as policy, Israel, all we want is to have a good neighbor there, and wishing well to our Syrian neighbors after many years of suffering, hundreds of thousands of killed and millions displaced. But since all the components are not clear yet, and we don't know where that is going to go, especially using the lessons we have from October 7th, what we need to ensure is that strategic capabilities won't fall into the wrong hands and won't be employed towards Israel. So a lot of what we've been doing is not really strategic, it's more tactic, making sure that these things are not there. These abilities are taken away. Probably all the players in the region are happy with what we're doing. Even sometimes if you hear criticism, that criticism really means nothing. Even in recent days, we've seen, even yesterday, I think we've seen more strikes by Israel to take out various components. We can even understand the logic in that. And I don't think this should be seen as something that's opposing a future regime in Syria. It's just understanding that some capabilities, by the way, they don't need at all. Certainly nobody wants chemical weapons in the wrong hands. And since we don't understand if this is going in a negative place, we don't want this at all. Looking at the South, I think you can hear Israeli rhetoric that is a bit more forceful than maybe you would expect. Again, I would refer to the lessons of October 7th, also the alignment with the United States. So I think you can hear relatively powerful rhetoric by Israel now defining these red lines. I would even say chutzpah in a way for Israel to say, no forces south of this line, who are you to say? It's our place to say if we're looking out for our own security. Also look at the fact that we're acting in the area of separation, changing the way we coin the terminology there in a way to reflect what we're doing, more talking about security or area of security I think the terminology is changing as we speak, because all we intend to do is secure this area and make sure that no one threatens from there, and ultimately to see our forces back on the international border with whatever mechanism or regime we see in the area.
Absolutely. Well, Mr. Oren, I'd like to hear your take on that as well. But beyond the Israeli efforts, which I view as justified to ensure its national security interests are kept in light also of what we saw as a massacre, of course, along the Mediterranean coastline. Are the Israelis and Americans in this context aligned on the efforts vis-a-vis Syria?
Well, it depends on whether there are already two distinct policies to align. And as Professor Berman commented, as well as you yourself, there is no brand new Trump administration policy yet. Not everyone is in place yet. Some have been nominated but not yet confirmed. Others wait to be nominated. It's quite normal for a new administration. And we haven't seen the national security documents and foreign policy pronouncement. But if one can infer from what is happening right now, including the Israeli-Lebanese negotiations, which must be in some form or another under American auspices, yes, it seems as if both Jerusalem and Washington are at least looking at the same sheet of music, same page, and the fact that no one has condemned Israel for striking the hostile targets in Syria, except for one of the UN bodies saying, and Reuven mentioned the word chutzpah. This is another example of chutzpah. You know, the body in charge of finding and eliminating chemical weapons is still looking for them and eradicating them. Its head has warned that Israeli strikes might cause the dispersion of such chemical material. So the enemy is not the former regime, perhaps the new regime, and its use of chemical weapons, but the Israeli effort to get rid of them. But other than that, there is unanimity that what Israel has been doing is for the better, and we haven't heard anything out of Washington to contradict it.
Indeed. Well, in one of the public statements made by Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz, he did highlight that the Americans are aligned with the Israelis and that the United States promised support in international fora in the event that Israel would need such support. Moreover, particularly also after the massacre in the Mediterranean coastline, both in Latakia, Tartus, and other places, it was quite apparent in the statement by the U.S. State Department that they used a terminology with regard to the forces of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or the current de facto security forces of Damascus, as terrorists or radical jihadist terrorists, something that, of course, speaks volumes, and fighting alongside foreign jihadists. So they do distinct between the two, but the reference to terrorists is mentioned there, and it's mentioned in every statement that came to date about the references to the current regime. And on that, Professor Berman, we're talking here about a president of the United States that happens to be a New Yorker. I'm sure that he, as well as anybody else around the world who cares about America and Western civilization, was seemingly remembers at least the moment of 9/11 and the days after, which were brought about by this Al-Qaeda terrorist organization. The people who make up the current regime in Damascus happen to be people who praised and supported that terrorist attack against the United States, and subsequently also joined Al-Qaeda to be proactive fighters against America. In that context, if personalities matter, many of the people in government today in the United States have joined the government because of 9/11, as many of them have put it. And subsequently, we also see many of the various leaders speaking out over the years about Al-Qaeda, including in their Senate confirmations, about the fact that, we're talking here about Al-Qaeda trying to consolidate power in Damascus, something they just don't understand how it's possible. Is that going to give us, or is all of that giving us some type of an understanding of what we may expect from the current leadership in Washington?
Jonathan, I don't know if the trauma of 9/11 is still what is driving U.S. Foreign policy on the personal level. That's probably different from each individual to the next. And the fact that President Trump is from New York explains his subtle use of language. I think there's another aspect of this that is perhaps more relevant in terms of the policy level. The 9/11 trauma focused U.S. policy from 2001 until the 2016, 2017 on counterterrorism. The national security strategy of 2017 in the first Trump administration shifted to great power competition. That is, thinking about China and Russia as the main focus. This didn't mean that counter ISIS disappeared, but it was no longer the touchstone for all U.S. Policy. To the extent that you may be picking up on a shift back to terrorism, to counterterrorism as the key concern in Washington, could indicate a shift away from the great power competition component. The great power competition foreign policy frame might have led Washington to think about Syria in terms primarily of getting Russia out. That's a reasonable goal for American foreign policy in the context of competition with Russia. But this administration may be shifting on Russia, as we see in the Ukraine debate, and maybe that is explaining a return to the concern with terrorism. Of course, however, we have this terrible events that took place on the coast of Syria. They deserve condemnation, whatever the policy frame is. And what is to be determined is whether the biography of Jolani, whether Jolani's past is Jolani's future, or whether Jolani will credibly distance himself from that past. Whether Jolani is himself culpable, did he order the massacre in Latakia, or was that rogue elements within his undisciplined operation? I can't speak on that, but that is the kind of picking apart of details that has to be done.
And before the dust settles, unfortunately, the European Union has decided to invite al-Jolani to Brussels to discuss the future of Damascus and Syria at large as part of the donor conference for Syria, something that I personally don't understand, and I am going and have already spoken to many European leaders and senior practitioners on this matter. I'd like now to turn to Colonel Ben Shalom and ask you particularly, in this context, we're talking here about a country that has not yet consolidated its power over the entire territory. Nonetheless, there is a very broad effort by the Europeans, particularly France, if I may add, as well as Qatar and Turkey, to push for the success of this HDS organization to consolidate its power in Damascus. And of course, it is being done also in concert with countries such as the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that seeks also to ensure that it maintains power in Syria. How does Israel take all of that into account?
Well, I think what we should do is see all these international engagements or involvement as very positive. In Israel, we tend to see things local. We tend to see things as our problem to solve. And here, I think every international intervention is positive. Certainly, you see the various players now looking out for their own interests. Also, here, we have to see it in a multidimensional way, not necessarily, for instance, look at Turkey on the negative side of their involvement, but perhaps their involvement could also lead to stability. Referencing the comments we just heard now, very wise, by the way, that led me to think about this whole possible shift to the United States. I think the focus still is the great power competition and how this plays into that. For us in Israel, I think the main change in Syria has been the fall of the Iranian axis, which was extremely positive and perhaps could have been almost celebrated here if it were not this shift now to this other element that is very negative. Another interesting thing I would point out, or sad point I would point out, that atrocities can happen in the world that nobody cares about. We've seen this around the Middle East. As Israelis, many times we complain that when something happens and it relates to Israel, then everyone cares, even if it's just a fragment of things happening elsewhere. We've also seen this in Syria. The massacre now happening in Syria now should have a world outcry and world involvement and try to go to the roots of that and prevent that from happening. Bottom line, to answer your question, I think all international engagement is positive. I may surprise you by saying that even engaging the self-declared president of Syria now, despite his background, if he is now in power, I am for speaking to him, engaging him, of course, not believing every word that he says and not being overly optimistic, but certainly if he is the main player in Syria now, try to engage him to try to push this thing forward. The last thing I wanted to say is about U.S. presence here in Syria and maybe the question of their boots on the ground. I think their involvement is very important. And I guess and I hope that CENTCOM is giving the right advice to Washington, and maybe we'll see the outcome of this in the near future.
Indeed. Well, in Hebrew, we say "chovat ha'ochacha alav," which means basically that he needs to prove himself by his actions, not just his words. Something that we unfortunately have seen to the contrary in the Mediterranean coastline with the massacres occurring there. But nonetheless, Mr. Oren, I'd like to point also out that some of those people who fled from the coastline fled into Lebanon, where we saw also clashes between Sunni and Shia militants in the city of Tartus and its vicinity. What can you tell us about that, and to what degree are the events in Syria impacting the situation in Lebanon?
Well, the big surprise is that we are surprised. Knowing what we know about blood feuds, especially in the Middle East, it used to be in Ireland, in Scandinavia, and many other places around the world. But one of the last vestiges of such blood feuds, of people about whom saying that they are bearing a grudge would be a gross understatement. Bashir Gemayel became the president of Lebanon after the Lebanese forces massacred their way into Beirut, and after he was assassinated, of course. And they looked so civil, they looked so elegant, so French. Nevertheless, those Syrians who have suffered under the Alawites, the Assad family, and their collaborators for 53 years. Obviously, some of them took revenge regardless of who is going to be massacred, women, children. And of course, it's going to be a cycle of violence. Now, in Lebanon, they used to suffer Syrian intervention, and Hezbollah came to the rescue of the Assad family, but no more. So the fact that the Lebanese are now resenting the entry of the Alawites, again, the Assad sect, is positive, even if the means they are undertaking sometimes be negative.
Indeed. In one sentence, what should we focus on in the short to medium term as well as the long term in 1.5 sentences each? Professor Berman, we'll start with you.
I think we should clarify the culpability of what happened in Latakia. Was it local? Was it the foreign fighters? Or was it ordered from Damascus?
Colonel Ben Shalom.
For us, it has to be security, still taking out, making sure the battlefield here in our immediate proximity is safe, and making sure that the whole picture, including the mechanism in Lebanon, looks forward, because maybe Lebanon is the most positive aspect of what's going on now.
Mr. Oren?
Well, what Minister Katz said regarding the cooperation with the Druze communities, including giving work permits to some of the Druze who would like to come and labor within the Israeli-held Golan Heights, where there are, of course, Druze communities. This is a very positive development.
Indeed. Well, one of the main reasons for that is that the HTS regime in Damascus continues to bar the distribution of electricity to the Sweda government and others, and therefore they only have roughly 2 hours compared to the 12 and 14 hours in all other governorates, as is the case despite the fact that much of this humanitarian aid is Western given, which is also a point to be made, and much of the food and the necessities to accommodate the people in Sweda and elsewhere are, of course, also in very dire conditions, and therefore Israel is stepping in and is going to help the Druze there, and that is a very blessed and welcomed endeavor. But with that, I'd like to thank Professor Russell Berman, Colonel Reuven Ben Shalom, and Mr. Amir Oren for all of your insights. And I'd like to immediately thank all of you at home as well. Until our next edition from here in Jerusalem. Shalom.
I'm Eran, former Deputy National Security Advisor here in Israel, a diplomat, a strategist by training. I'm very happy to be at TV7 and offer my interpretation along my esteemed colleagues. The strong point of TV7 is to be a reliable source of authoritative insight in an era of shallow news environment that is very difficult for viewers to trust.